Rain hammered the black umbrellas like bullets. A sealed coffin glistened under the gray sky. People whispered not prayers but rumors. At the edge of the crowd, a young man clenched his fists so tightly his nails cut his palms. His name was Christopher Hale, and before this day was over, he would discover his father hadn't simply died. He had been buried alive in betrayal. The sky over Black Ridge Cemetery was a sheet of pewter, heavy with unspent rain. A cold wind chased the scent of damp earth across the rows of mourners dressed in black. They huddled under umbrellas, their faces blurred behind veils of mist. Christopher Hale stood apart from them, hands shoved into the pockets of his dark coat, staring at the polished coffin that lay at the center of it all like a secret no one dared to open. His father, Alexander Hale, was supposed to be inside that coffin, a titan of industry, a man whose name could open doors in every bank and boardroom from Manhattan to Dubai, now reduced to a sealed box and hurried prayers. The official story, a sudden heart attack while traveling abroad, but the details gnawed at Christopher's mind like rats in the walls. No open casket, a rushed burial arranged within days of the death, no time for an autopsy, no explanation, only signatures and sealed documents. He scanned the crowd. The faces he recognized, senators, CEOs, family friends, all wore the same expression, polite grief mixed with something colder. Money changed people, power silenced them. The whispers rose and fell like a tide, and every wave carried his name. Christopher, followed by words he couldn't quite make out. Near the front, a woman in a black silk hat stood like a queen at court, Victoria Hale, his stepmother. Her beauty had always been sharp, like a blade dressed as jewelry. Today, she was radiant and composed, one gloved hand resting on the arm of her son Damon. Damon had his father's height and none of his warmth. He glanced back at Christopher once, a smirk flickering at the edge of his mouth, as if the funeral were a private joke. The priest droned on. Christopher's gaze kept drifting to the coffin. As non sad fries hatters ap prefer. Teen. He imagined his father inside, imagined his chest rising once more, imagined him sitting up and pointing a finger at the two people who now stood to inherit everything. The thought was absurd, but so was the sealed lid, the absence of a final goodbye. When the service ended, Victoria glided toward him. Her perfume was faint and icy. "Christopher," she said, voice as soft as snowfall. "You look tired." "I should," he replied, forcing a smile. "I just buried my father." Her lips curved. "We all did." Then she was gone, swept into a circle of donors and attorneys, her black dress trailing like smoke. Damon lingered a moment longer. "Dad always said you were too sentimental," he murmured. "Guess he was right." "Mm-hmm." He patted Christopher's shoulder as if comforting a child. "Some men aren't built for this world." Now Christopher watched him walk away, and a cold certainty began to take root. Something about the way Damon held himself, confident, rehearsed, made him think of a man who'd already rehearsed this scene 100 times. He followed the crowd to the reading of the will held in a side chapel on the cemetery grounds. The walls smelled of damp stone and candle wax. A notary cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. The words echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Bequests to charities, properties divided, business shares transferred, names, numbers, clauses, and then nothing. No mention of Christopher, not a single dollar, not even a keepsake. It was as if he'd been erased from his father's life. Entirely. He felt the blood drain from his face. "Excuse me," he interrupted, his voice raw. The notary looked at him with bureaucratic pity. "These are the final instructions signed and notarized by your father, Mr. Hale." Victoria's eyes glittered. Damon folded his arms, leaning back in the pew. "Dad made his choice," he said, loud enough for the others to hear. "He wanted the stronger son to carry the legacy." Laughter rippled through the room, muffled but cruel. Christopher's fists clenched. For a moment he considered lunging at Damon, dragging him across the polished floor until that smirk broke. But the weight of every stare held him back. This was not the time, not yet. He walked out instead, the air outside sharp as knives. The rain had started, thin needles stinging his face. Behind him, the chapel door closed on a burst of muffled conversation, the echo of his father's name, now no longer his. He stood at the edge of the cemetery road, staring at the long black limousines. Inside them, Victoria and Damon would be plotting their next move, smiling at their victory. The world thought he had lost everything. In truth, he had only lost the illusion of family. The reality was far darker. A gust of wind flipped his coat collar. He thought of his father's last phone call weeks ago, abrupt, uneasy. "We'll talk soon, son," Alexander had said. "There are things you need to know." Rand Preek. That conversation would never happen now. Or maybe it already had in the whispers and sealed envelopes that had brought him to this day. Christopher looked back at the grave. The coffin had disappeared beneath the earth. The headstone was a blank slab waiting for letters. He imagined carving his own message there one day, something that spoke the truth. He turned and walked down the gravel path, rain soaking through his shoes. With every step, the world behind him grew smaller, until only one thought filled his mind like a pulse. This wasn't fate. This was blood, and blood could be answered. He did not know how long he stood under the iron gates at the cemetery's exit, but when he finally moved, he was no longer the same man who had walked in. The boy who had trusted, who had hoped, had been buried along with his father. The man who stepped out into the storm carried something else entirely, a silent oath. They think they've buried Alexander Hale, he thought, but today they buried me too. The difference is, I'm coming back. The storm had followed Christopher across the city like a shadow. By the time he reached the Hale estate, the rain had turned to mist, clinging to the wrought iron gates and marble lions like a shroud. He hadn't planned to come here, his feet had simply carried him. Some part of him still wanted a goodbye, a memory, a trace of his father's presence. The mansion had been his childhood fortress, a place of summer dinners on the terrace, midnight chess games with Alexander in the library. Now it loomed ahead of him like a stranger's castle. The gates opened at the buzz of his code, one of the few things they hadn't yet erased. As he walked up the gravel drive, the house rose out of the fog, its windows glowing gold. But the warmth was a lie. Inside, he knew the air would be cold. He stepped into the grand foyer. The scent of lemon polish and fresh paint hit him first. Portraits that once hung on the walls, his grandparents, his father in his Navy uniform, were gone. In their place hung modern art, all sharp angles and bleeding colors, Victoria's taste. Even the rug had been replaced. It was as if they'd scrubbed the house of memory. "Christopher," her voice drifted down the marble stair. Victoria stood at the top, a glass of wine in her hand, draped in black silk like a queen in mourning. Only her eyes betrayed her mood, icy amused. She descended slowly, each heel clicking on the marble. Had side in some reaction, some purport ben to beride attained spur derision. "We're in middle of the Nair. You should have called," she said. "We're in the middle of restructuring." "I'm not staying," Christopher said. "I came to collect some things from my father's study." She tilted her head. "The study isn't yours anymore, neither is the room upstairs. We've cleared them out." He felt the words like a slap. "You've cleared them out? Already?" Damon's voice came from the parlor. "Weeks ago." He strolled in, tie loosened, a glass of scotch in hand. "You should see it now. Looks like a real man's office." Christopher clenched his jaw. "It was my father's," Damon said. "Everything changes." Christopher moved past them toward the hallway that led to the study, but Victoria blocked his path with a single step. "Don't," she said softly. "You don't belong here anymore. You embarrassed yourself at the will reading." "Don't make it worse." "Embarrassed myself?" He laughed once bitter. Glossma smiled. "We all did. All did. Some of us just learned to accept it." Damon raised his glass. "Dad made his choice, little brother. He saw who could carry the legacy. You're not cut out for it. You're softballs." The word landed harder than he expected. Soft, weak. That was how they'd always framed him. Bookish, idealistic. The boy who preferred his father's stories to his stepmother's parties. He saw now how neatly the narrative had been built, and how his father's death had sealed it. He stepped back. "Hets one tech onster more samba storty's mind was man scan to bin flippin' ca this." He stepped back. "I'll take what's mine." Victoria's eyes glittered. "You have nothing here." He looked around the foyer, the staircase where his father had carried him on his shoulders as a boy, the chandelier whose crystals had once thrown rainbows across his birthday cakes. All of it gone, or turned against him, a museum of someone else's memories. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. Damon's voice followed him, a taunting echo. "Maybe start a blog about your feelings." He stopped at the threshold, rain hissing beyond the open doors. Slowly he looked back over his shoulder. "Enjoy it," he said quietly. "Every inch, every dollar, every secret." His eyes flicked to Victoria's. "For just a heartbeat, it won't last." Then he stepped out into the rain. On the drive back into the city, the estate shrank behind him, a silhouette fading into mist. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. They thought they had won. They thought exile would break him, but as the miles passed, something hardened inside him. The pieces began to fit together. The sealed coffin, the rushed burial, the rewritten will. His father's death wasn't convenient. It was orchestrated. By the time the skyline rose ahead of him, glittering with 1,000 windows, he had stopped shaking. The house was no longer his. He whispered the words into the empty car. "I will not rest, not until the truth is mine." The city swallowed him, neon reflecting in the wet streets like fire on oil. Somewhere in its depths a new life waited, one he would build, piece by piece, weapon by weapon. The boy had been pushed out of his home. The man would return for a reckoning. Rain still slicked the streets the night Christopher Hale disappeared. His apartment lease lapsed, his phone went dead, and his name began to fade from the gossip columns. For the city, it was as if the disgraced son of Alexander Hale had finally been broken and blown away. But in truth, the boy who had been humiliated in his own home had died that night on the highway. The man who emerged at the next dawn carried no name at all. He began in small, invisible ways. A sublet in a crumbling building under a false surname, cashed jobs at night while studying during the day. He let his beard grow, cut his hair differently, changed the cadence of his speech. The mirror became a rehearsal stage where Christopher Hale learned to vanish. By day, he haunted public libraries and cheap universities, registering for courses under forged IDs, law at first, the mechanics of contracts, the language of loopholes, then finance, how money moved through shell companies and offshore accounts like blood through hidden veins. And finally, psychology, not the soft kind with couches and confessions, but the hard science of persuasion, manipulation, and behavioral traps. His notebooks filled with diagrams of human greed, lists of case studies, transcripts of famous cons. Nights were spent in the city's underbelly, poker rooms, freight docks, private security gigs, even a stint as a paralegal in a boutique firm known for cleaning up wealthy clients' messes. He listened more than he spoke. Patterns emerged. Names reappeared. Victoria Hale's holding company, Damon's Investment Ventures. He clipped articles, saved PDFs to encrypted drives, memorized shell corporations. Slowly, the shadow of fraud sharpened into a map. Years passed, seasons blurred. In one city, he was a graduate student named Daniel Crow. In another, a mid-level analyst named Michael St. James. Each identity built a skill, a contact, a favor owed. He learned to speak in boardroom language and in dockside slang to move between gala and warehouse without drawing notice. Every new role was a tool, every contact a future lever. Sometimes late at night he dreamed of his father. The dreams never showed Alexander's face, only his voice saying, "There are things you need to know." He woke from those dreams with the taste of metal in his mouth and went back to work. One winter, hidden behind the name Evan Ross, he interned at a forensic accounting firm. There, while sifting through a stack of routine filings, he saw a number that froze him. A dormant subsidiary of Hale Industries, a company he had never heard of, paying out large consulting fees to a private trust controlled by Victoria. The dates matched the months before Alexander's death. The amounts were staggering. Now he dug deeper at night, breaking every internal rule: dummy boards, inflated invoices, transfers to accounts and jurisdictions famous for secrecy. By spring, he had a chain of evidence that suggested not only embezzlement, but a cover-up of something larger. A life insurance policy quietly voided. Medical records sealed a doctor who had vanished overseas. He did not yet have proof of murder, but he had a shape, an outline. It would be another 2 years before he had enough. He built a second encrypted archive, cross-referencing transactions, witness statements, and the financial rise of Damon Hale. He created timelines, mapped social networks, and tagged weak points. He even paid private investigators, under yet another name, to track down staff from his father's last trip. 2 of them hinted at strange instructions from Victoria about medication and travel schedules, but refused to go on record. He didn't push, not yet. Patience had become his armor. He had learned that a predator in tall grass does not lunge too soon. It lets the prey wander closer until escape is impossible. As the 10th year of his exile approached, Christopher was no longer the thin, furious young man who had stood in the rain outside the Hale estate. His shoulders were broader now, his voice steadier. His bank accounts, built from careful investments and side ventures, had grown into a private war chest. He owned nothing in his own name, and yet controlled enough assets to wound a small empire. The final piece fell into place in an unremarkable cafe near the harbor. A retired nurse met him there, a woman who had been on Alexander Hale's flight the week he died. She recognized Christopher from a photograph he had shown, but not from the man sitting across from her. Her hands shook as she stirred her tea. "I shouldn't be telling you this," she whispered, "but your father, he wasn't ill, he was strong. The medication, the sudden change of hotels, it wasn't normal. And then he was gone." When she left, she slid a tiny flash drive across the table, her personal journal from that trip, filled with notes she had been too afraid to share. He didn't even open it there. He simply pocketed it, left cash on the table, and walked out into the dusk. On the long walk back to his apartment, the city seemed to move around him in slow motion. He felt the years like a weight across his shoulders, and yet also like a blade he had been sharpening. Every humiliation, every sleepless night, every false identity had brought him here. He had the skills, the money, the evidence, and the patience. All that remained was the return. In his apartment, little more than a desk, a bed, and walls lined with files. He sat in the dark and opened the nurse's flash drive. The screen glowed blue, words filled it, dates, times, symptoms, receipts. He scrolled, read, scrolled again. When he reached the final entry, a slow smile spread across his face. Not the smile of a man at peace, but of a hunter who has finally sighted his prey. Outside, the harbor fog rolled in, muffling the sounds of the city. Inside, Christopher Hale closed the laptop, leaned back in his chair, and let the smile remain. The boy was gone. The man was ready, he whispered into the dark. It's time. The invitation arrived on cream-colored stationery, embossed with the Hale crest. To most people it meant prestige, access, and champagne. To Christopher Hale it meant entry. 10 years of shadows had led to this. The moment he would step back into the world that had buried him. He wasn't Christopher anymore. Not on paper. The name on the RSVP was Adrian Cole, a low-profile investor with a portfolio of tech startups and clean energy ventures. The identity was airtight, tax filings, a tasteful website, a muted LinkedIn profile, even a few staged interviews in niche business journals. Behind it all lay the war chest and contacts he had built under a dozen other names. Adrian Cole was everything Christopher Hale had never been: polished, confident, anonymous. He rehearsed the persona the way an actor rehearses a role, voice lower, accent slightly different, suits tailored to project understated power. He even changed his gait, slowing his stride to suggest a man who expected people to wait for him. The final touch was a subtle scar along his jawline, a gift from a staged ski accident years before. When he looked in the mirror, he saw only Adrian. His first move had been financial. Under Adrian Cole's name, he had quietly bought into one of Damon Hale's riskier ventures, a renewable energy fund that promised high returns but was thinly capitalized. Then another, a logistics startup Damon had acquired in a blaze of press releases. To Damon, Adrian Cole was a gift, a wealthy investor with impeccable discretion. To Christopher, Damon was bait. Weeks became months. Adrian Cole appeared at board meetings, fundraising dinners, private luncheons. He spoke little, asked intelligent questions, and always signed the checks Damon waved in front of him. Each time Damon pushed for a riskier move, Adrian nodded, adding a suggestion here, a whisper there. Slowly, Damon's portfolio shifted toward high volatility plays. The trap was being baited by Damon's own ego. Meanwhile, Adrian moved against Victoria in ways she couldn't see. At quiet lunches with her allies, old family lawyers, key board members, society patrons, he dropped hints about certain irregularities he'd noticed in Damon's accounts. Not accusations, just murmurs, a raised eyebrow, a sympathetic sigh. In high society, a rumor well-placed is more powerful than a lawsuit. At night, in his penthouse apartment across the river, the mask slipped and Christopher emerged again. He spread documents across the table, cash flow projections, forged emails, transcripts of whispered conversations, and mapped out the next steps. He felt no guilt, only precision. The first crack appeared at a quarterly investor call. Damon, eager to impress, had overpromised on a shipping route expansion financed by Adrian's silent backing. When a journalist asked a pointed question about regulatory clearance, Damon snapped and gave an evasive answer. The clip went viral among industry blogs, a minor embarrassment, but Christopher saw the tremor it sent through Victoria's camp. The second crack came weeks later. A key supplier withdrew from one of Damon's deals, citing due diligence concerns. In reality, Christopher had orchestrated it, using a shell company to buy out the supplier's debt and steer them elsewhere. Damon's temper began to show. He called Adrian late at night, ranting about sabotage. Adrian soothed him, promising more capital if Damon stayed the course. Victoria remained cool in public, but Christopher noticed her eyes following him at gatherings. She didn't know why, but something about Adrian Cole unsettled her. Perhaps it was the way he listened more than he spoke. Perhaps it was the faint echo of a smile she'd once seen on a boy she thought she'd destroyed. The confrontation built like a storm. It broke at the Hale Foundation's winter gala, held in the very ballroom where Christopher had celebrated his 16th birthday. The chandeliers glittered like captured stars. The orchestra played a waltz he remembered from childhood. He arrived early in a midnight blue suit, blending seamlessly with senators, bankers, and patrons. Was already on stage, basking in attention as he unveiled a new initiative, a bold but reckless merger funded largely by Adrian Cole's silent investment. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled. Christopher stood at the edge of the crowd, glass in hand, watching the man who had mocked him at his father's funeral now stumble toward the same abyss he had dug for himself. He felt a presence beside him. Victoria. Dressed in emerald silk diamonds at her throat, she looked every inch the queen she had always wanted to be. But up close her eyes were sharper, scanning, calculating. "You're Adrian Cole," she said softly. He inclined his head. "Miss Hale, I've heard a great deal about you. Only good things, I hope." She studied him. "You're very familiar. Have we met before?" A slow smile. "Not in this lifetime." For a heartbeat, the music and chatter fell away. Her pupils narrowed. A flicker of recognition passed across her face like a shadow. Then the crowd surged. Damon called her name from the stage, and the moment broke. But Christopher saw it. He saw the first glint of fear in her eyes. As the orchestra swelled and cameras flashed, he raised his glass toward the stage, his reflection caught in the crystal. For 10 years he had been a ghost. Tonight the ghost had walked back into their world. And they still didn't know the hunter standing among them. One by one, names began slipping from Damon Hale's investor list. A long-time fund abruptly pulled out of a major project. A shipping magnate stopped returning calls. A trusted partner postponed a deal until the next quarter and then indefinitely. On paper, everything still looked solid. Inside the spreadsheets, cash flow was bleeding. Damon blamed the markets. Victoria blamed the usual fair-weather friends. Only Adrian Cole, once known under another name, understood the real cause. Every withdrawal had been orchestrated, a string plucked until the music stopped. He moved like a surgeon, a whispered caution here, a leaked memo there. He channeled Damon toward new opportunities that promised salvation but demanded more leverage, pushing the risk until Damon's empire balanced on a knife edge. And Damon, driven by ego and desperate to prove his genius, kept signing. Meanwhile, Adrian undermined Victoria more subtly. In carefully seeded blogs and trade papers, hints began to appear. Questions about opaque finances, whispers of undisclosed lobbying, murmurings about offshore accounts. Nothing provable, just enough smoke for patrons to start sniffing for fire. Invitations to her fundraisers dwindled. A promised endowment evaporated. Her carefully curated image began to tarnish. Behind closed doors, the tension thickened. Damon's calls to Adrian swung from charm to rage. Victoria's eyes tracked Adrian at every event, her smile thinner, her questions sharper. Nisa nodded. She couldn't yet name the familiarity, but felt it in her bones. The more she searched, the more he fed her false trails. A fabricated resume, decoy social media accounts, even a staged acquaintance to vouch for Adrian Cole. She chased ghosts while the walls closed in. Then came the scandal. A whistleblower from Damon's shipping arm released internal documents, materials Adrian had found and sent anonymously to a journalist. Allegations of overbilling and environmental violations exploded across the business channels. Within days, regulators launched inquiries. Stock prices dipped. Damon raged, calling for heads to roll, but the board demanded explanations. At the same time, an old photograph surfaced online. Victoria and the lobbyist on a private yacht, champagne flutes raised. It was blurry, but the implication was clear. Society pages buzzed. Victoria issued denials. Damon glared at her across boardroom tables, his loyalty fraying. Christopher watched it all unfold from his penthouse. The city skyline reflected in his glass of bourbon. Years of patience now bore fruit, yet he moved carefully. A predator does not reveal itself before the kill. The board meeting that would change everything began like any other. A high-ceilinged conference room, polished wood table, screens glowing with charts. Cameras from an internal PR crew rolled unobtrusively in the corner, meant to capture behind-the-scenes footage for a new investor reel. Damon strutted in late tie, loose face flushed from a night of damage control. Victoria sat stiffly at the far end, eyes cold. Adrian Cole, Christopher, took his usual seat near the middle, quiet pen poised over a notepad. The agenda began: quarterly losses, pending investigations, investor withdrawals. Damon interrupted every speaker, his voice rising. When a board member asked about compliance costs, Damon slammed a fist on the table. "I built this empire," he shouted. "None of you would be here without me." The cameras kept rolling. Victoria's gaze flicked to Adrian. For the first time, he saw true panic behind her eyes, not at the scandals but at Damon's unraveling. She opened her mouth to calm him, but Damon rounded on her instead. "Maybe if you kept your private life out of the papers." "Mother," he sneered, "we wouldn't be in this mess." A collective gasp. Pierre Crude's cameras zoomed instinctively. In that instant, Christopher knew the footage would go viral. "Oh," Damon continued, voice cracking. Everyone thinks you're the power behind me, but you're nothing without my deals. Nothing! He swept his arm across the table, sending a glass of water crashing to the floor. I don't need any of you. I don't need anyone. Silence. The only sound was the hum of the camera. Christopher lowered his pen and looked up, expression unreadable. Around the table, board members exchanged glances. Even Victoria sat frozen and in that silence, Christopher felt the shift, the moment when an empire built on theft and arrogance began to collapse under its own weight. Later that afternoon, the clip of Damon's meltdown hit the business networks. Within hours, it trended on social media, spliced with headlines about the ongoing investigations and Victoria's rumored infidelity. Stockholders panicked, banks tightened credit lines, reporters camped outside the Hale offices. The once flawless image of the family rotted in public view. In his apartment, Christopher watched the footage on a muted screen. Damon's face contorted with rage, Victoria's eyes darting like a trapped animal, the board members recoiling. He took a slow breath. This was only the beginning, but the cracks were now visible to everyone. He closed the laptop and leaned back, the city lights flickering across his face. For years he had been a shadow, now his work was daylight. The empire that had destroyed him was destroying itself, and Victoria was finally truly afraid. It began with a single envelope, thick and cream-colored, slid under Victoria Hale's office door. Inside were photographs, bank transfers to shell companies in the Caymans, a lab report hinting at digitalis in her late husband's bloodstream, a copy of the forged will she and Damon had filed. No signature, no note, just a date and an address for a private meeting. Victoria's hands trembled as she read. For years she had dismissed the rumors about Adrian Cole as paranoia. Now, for the first time, she felt a cold certainty. The stranger inside her empire wasn't a stranger at all. And Rocket. The appointed meeting place was not a boardroom or hotel, but an abandoned Dock wing of the family's first warehouse, a symbolic ruin of their beginnings. The floors were covered in dust, the air heavy with the smell of rust and old paper. A single chair waited under a hanging bulb. Victoria arrived alone, heels echoing like gunshots. She was dressed for war, dark suit, pearls, a mask of dignity over panic. From the shadows, Christopher stepped forward. Gone was the mild-mannered Adrian Cole. In his eyes burned the same green fire she had seen once before at a funeral beside a sealed coffin. I wondered how long it would take, he said softly. You? She breathed. Christopher, her voice cracked on his name. He laid a briefcase on the chair and clicked it open. Inside lay her life's crimes, catalogued with forensic precision. Photocopies, sworn affidavits, hard drives. You forged his will, Christopher said. You moved funds through 6 companies to hide the theft, and you poisoned him when you realized he might change the inheritance. Victoria's face blanched. You can't prove, he slid a USB drive across the table. I already did. And tomorrow, so will every major news outlet in this city. Now, she tried to summon the old arrogance, but it slipped like ash through her fingers. You think you'll survive this? Damon will crush you. Christopher smiled, cold, surgical. Damon is already halfway there. He's been signing deals I arrange, taking loans from banks I control. And when the authorities come, the trail leads back to both of you. Unless, of course, you turn on him first. At that very moment, in another office across town, Damon was opening his own envelope. Inside were Victoria's bank statements and a confidential memo leaked to him by Adrian Cole. The message was clear. His mother had been siphoning funds behind his back and setting him up as the fall guy. Damon's fury was volcanic. Years of manipulation and humiliation boiled over. He called her, but she did not answer. Instead, he called a journalist. You want a story? He growled. I've got one. By the time Victoria stumbled back from the warehouse meeting, federal agents were already freezing their accounts. The media broke the story at dawn. Hale dynasty under criminal investigation, mother and son at war. Stock tickers flashed red, employees fled, lawyers lined up like vultures. Christopher orchestrated the reveal like theater. He released the documents in stages, timing each leak to maximize impact. First came the forged will and embezzlement evidence. Then the poison report. Then Damon's audio recordings, his own words damning him and his mother. Television anchors debated the greatest corporate betrayal of the decade. Social media exploded with memes of Damon screaming in the boardroom. Victoria's face, once a symbol of iron control, appeared on magazine covers under the headline Poison and Power. Inside the Hale estate, security staff left. Phones rang unanswered. The grand house was silent except for lawyers' footsteps. Desperate, Victoria returned to the warehouse one last time. She found Christopher waiting on the loading dock, rain hammering the tin roof. You've destroyed us. she spat. Are you proud? I didn't destroy you, he replied. You did, I just made sure the world saw it. She reached for him as if he were still the boy she had once scolded at dinner. Christopher, listen to me. He stepped back. I listened for years while you buried my father, while you threw me out of my own home. Now the world is listening to me. For a heartbeat they stood there, two ghosts in the rain, everything between them burned to cinders. Within weeks the Hale empire crumbled, creditors seized properties, prosecutors filed charges. Dahman cornered turned state's witness against his mother to save himself. Victoria's last public appearance was in handcuffs, head bowed, pearls gone. Christopher watched from a distance as the news played on a muted television in a diner. No champagne, no victory speech, just a quiet exhale. The revenge he had dreamed of was complete. In the flickering light of the screen, his reflection looked older, harder. He had won, but at the cost of becoming a stranger even to himself. The cemetery was silent, except for the whisper of winter wind across the stones. Snow had begun to fall, slow, deliberate flakes settling like ash. A black car waited at the edge of the lane, engine idling. Christopher Hale stood alone among the markers, hands bare, despite the cold, a small bouquet of white lilies trembling in his grip. The headstone was simple, Jonathan Hale, beloved father, visionary, gone too soon, no mention of betrayal. No hint of the poison, the forged will, the years of quiet cruelty that had followed. Only granite and dates carved with indifference. Christopher knelt and laid the lilies at the base. For a long time he said nothing. The man who had orchestrated the destruction of an empire seemed for an instant like the boy who had once followed his father through these same gates, fingers curled around a larger hand. I kept my promise, he said finally, voice low. I found the truth. I gave you justice. They'll never hurt anyone again. A gust of wind rattled the dead leaves against the stone. He closed his eyes. I thought it would feel like victory, he murmured. But it feels like silence. He saw himself in fragments, years hidden behind false names, friendships he could never form, nights alone in furnished apartments, building a weapon out of patience. Each memory was a shadow cast by his father's grave. The price of vengeance had not been money or blood, but time, the only thing he could never reclaim. A flash of memory rose unbidden, his father at the breakfast table laughing at a headline, telling him to stand tall, to fight for what was right. That laugh had been the heartbeat of the house. When it stopped, the house had become a mausoleum. Christopher opened his eyes. I'm not the son you buried, he said. I'm not the son you buried, Nampin. I'm something else now. He reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed envelope addressed to the district attorney, his last act. Inside was the location of the remaining offshore accounts and a confession of everything he had done to bring Victoria and Damon down. A record of the predator he had become, so that one day the world would know the full story. He placed it against the stone. No more secrets, he whispered. Not for you, not for me. For a moment the snow stopped, the world held its breath. In the distance, a bell-tolled church, or clock, or perhaps nothing at all. He rose, dusted the snow from his knees, and stood over the grave. Even when you left me to them, even when you couldn't save me. Goodbye, Father. He turned and began to walk back up the path. The camera of memory followed him from behind, a lone figure in a long coat. Footprints marking a line from the grave to the gates, each step erasing a piece of the boy he once was. At the top of the hill, he paused and looked back one last time. The headstone stood alone, a dark shape against the white. Then he walked on, past the waiting car, past the cemetery gates, into a future he could not yet imagine. He left behind not just his father's ghost, but the last remnants of the family that had betrayed him. Ahead lay only himself, no aliases, no masks, only the echo of what vengeance had cost. The snow closed over his footprints. The cemetery fell silent once more. At my father's funeral, my stepbrother whispered, "He left everything to me, you get nothing." They sealed the coffin before I could look inside. The mansion was sold overnight. But they didn't know I had already uncovered their secret.